In the spring of 2021, a research team working out of the University of California, Santa Cruz published a paper in the journal PLOS ONE that described something nobody had formally documented before. They had been tracking bald eagles in coastal California using GPS transmitters, motion-sensitive accelerometers, and time-stamped location data fine enough to capture individual wing beats, and buried in the behavioral record they had assembled was a hunting strategy that did not fit any of the existing descriptions of how bald eagles catch prey. It was not the opportunistic scavenging that generations of wildlife observers had associated with the species. It was not the aerial stoop toward fish that most people picture when they picture a bald eagle hunting. It was something more structured, more deliberate, and in its internal logic, more sophisticated than either of those behaviors. It was a coordinated flushing strategy in which individual eagles used other birds, specifically large flocks of wintering shorebirds and waterfowl, as instruments in a hunting sequence that could only work if the eagle executing it understood, in some functional sense, how those birds would respond to aerial pressure and how to position itself to exploit that response before it happened. The paper received a brief cycle of coverage in science journalism outlets. It was picked up by a handful of wildlife enthusiasts on social media. It was cited approvingly by researchers working on corvid cognition and raptor behavior, who noted that it fit a pattern of emerging discoveries about the complexity of raptor hunting strategies that the field had been slow to fully reckon with. Then, it largely faded from the public conversation, as most genuinely important scientific papers do, absorbed into the background radiation of ecological discovery that accumulates without ever quite crystallizing into a clear public understanding of what it actually means. What it means is worth taking the time to explain properly. If you want to understand why this discovery matters, you need to understand what was already known about bald eagle hunting behavior before 2021, and why the picture that had accumulated over more than 2 centuries of observation was simultaneously detailed and incomplete in a specific way that allowed this hunting strategy to exist, be practiced by birds across at least 3 coastal ecosystems, and go formally undocumented until the right combination of tracking technology and research focus was brought to bear on it. Before we get into the mechanics of what was found, if you find yourself learning something new in the next several minutes, hit subscribe now. The territory we're going into is deep, and the details matter, and staying with this one will be worth it. The bald eagle has been observed, described, painted, photographed, and studied longer than almost any other bird in North America. It is the national symbol of the United States, which means it carries a cultural weight that has shaped how people look at it. It is large enough to be impossible to miss in the field. It occupies habitats, coastlines, major river systems, large lakes that humans have always lived near and watched closely. Benjamin Franklin's famous complaint that the species was of bad moral character, being too lazy to catch its own fish and preferring to rob the osprey of its catch, represents a layer of early American ecological observation embedded in a political argument, and it contains, like most of Franklin's observations, a kernel of genuine accuracy that observers in the centuries following him expanded into a comprehensive portrait of a generalist predator that was unusually willing to exploit the work of other animals. The kleptoparasitism that Franklin noticed is real and well documented. Bald eagles steal fish from ospreys, from other eagles, from herons, and from each other with an opportunistic efficiency that reflects the core logic of their feeding strategy, which is to maximize caloric intake relative to energy expenditure across a wide range of prey and food types. They scavenge carcasses of deer, salmon, and marine mammals. They eat road-killed animals. In winter, they gather at fish hatcheries and fish ladders, where prey concentration reduces the energy cost of hunting to near zero. They rob sea otters of urchins. They have been documented eating carrion in conditions where the only other birds willing to approach the carcass are ravens. The image of the bald eagle as something between a predator and a scavenger, more flexible and pragmatic than noble, took hold in the American ornithological literature in the 19th century and proved durable enough to persist, with some modification, through most of the 20th. The modification came from a growing body of direct hunting observation and, eventually, from film documentation that made it possible to analyze the mechanics of active predation in real time. Bald eagles do actively hunt. They catch fish at the water surface by dropping from a low glide and snatching with their talons. They take waterfowl in the air, using a pursuit strategy that combines powered flight with the use of geography, driving prey birds toward shorelines, cliffs, or other barriers that reduce their escape options. They hunt rabbits and ground squirrels in open terrain, using a low coursing flight that minimizes visual detection until the final approach. They take colonial waterbirds from nesting colonies by walking through nesting areas on foot, an approach that most large raptors do not use and that exploits the specific defensive limitations of colony nesting species. They have been documented killing animals as large as white-tailed deer fawns, great blue herons, and Canada geese in attacks that require significant aerial agility and closing speed. All of this was known before 2021. What this body of knowledge represented, however accurate and detailed it was in its individual elements, was a catalogue of techniques rather than an analysis of strategy. It described what bald eagles did in specific hunting contexts, without fully addressing the question of whether and to what degree those techniques were connected into longer behavioral sequences that reflected planning, in the functional sense of an animal adjusting its behavior based on a model of how the environment, including other animals, would respond to its actions. The distinction matters, and it is where the 2021 paper drove a wedge into the existing literature. The research began, as many important discoveries do, with a question that seemed methodological rather than conceptual. The team at UC Santa Cruz, led by ecologist Juliet Lamb, was interested in understanding how bald eagles were using the coastal habitats of Monterey Bay during the winter months, when the bay hosts some of the highest concentrations of wintering shorebirds and waterfowl in North America. The questions they started with were distributional and energetic. Where were the eagles spending their time? How much time were they spending in active flight versus perching? How did their movement patterns correlate with the distribution of prey? These are the standard questions of foraging ecology, and the technology they were using, high-resolution GPS loggers with accelerometers sensitive enough to distinguish between different flight modes, was producing the kind of granular behavioral record that older observational methods could not. What began emerging from the data within the first winter of tracking was a pattern that did not fit the distributional and energetic questions they had started with. The eagles were not simply moving toward prey concentrations and hunting there. A subset of individuals were executing movement sequences that began away from the primary concentrations of shorebirds and waterfowl, moved toward those concentrations along trajectories that brought them in from upwind or from elevations that kept them below the visual horizon of the prey birds for as long as possible, and then transitioned into a specific flight behavior at a specific distance from the flock that the accelerometer data distinguished clearly from the approach behavior that preceded it. That transition point, and the behavior that followed it, was where the strategy lived. What the eagles were doing at the transition point was creating a disturbance, not targeting a specific individual within the flock, not entering the flock on a pursuit vector toward a specific bird they had selected during the approach. They were flying at the flock in a way that was specifically calibrated to flush it, to cause the entire flock, or a large portion of it, to take flight simultaneously, without targeting any individual bird in that initial pass. The flush itself was the first move. What happened after the flush was the part that no one had formally described. When a large flock of shorebirds or waterfowl is flushed by a predator, the flock does not simply scatter in all directions. It does something more structured than that, and the structure reflects millions of years of anti-predator evolution operating at the collective level. The flock contracts. Individual birds move closer together. The edges of the flock fold inward. The flock as a whole moves in a direction that is shaped by the geometry of the threat, away from the predator and toward whatever environmental features, the open water, the sky above the flock, the interior of a bay or marsh, offer the most escape options. The flock performs the aerial murmurations that have been documented in starlings and dunlins and other highly gregarious bird species. The flowing, shape-shifting mass movements that reflect the aggregate of thousands of individual evasion decisions governed by simple rules about distance to nearest neighbors and alignment with local movement direction. These movements are not random. They are predictable in their broad structure, even though they are unpredictable in their specific geometry at any given moment. The eagles that were executing the strategy the UC Santa Cruz team documented appeared to be exploiting the predictable structure of the flock response. After the initial flush, the eagle did not pursue the flushed flock directly. It repositioned. The GPS data showed a secondary movement that placed the eagle in a location relative to the now airborne flock that was not where it had been during the flush, not behind the flock in the position an eagle would occupy if it was simply pursuing the nearest available bird, but ahead of the flock, or lateral to it, or above it, positioned in a location that the flock's own evasive movement was carrying it toward. The eagle was moving to a point where the flock was going to be, not where the flock was. This distinction between moving toward where prey is and moving toward where prey will be is the core of what made the finding significant enough to generate the coverage it received in 2021 and the follow-on discussion it has generated in the behavioral ecology literature since. Predicting prey movement requires a model of prey behavior. It requires that the predator have, encoded in its behavior through some combination of instinct, experience, and learning, a representation of how prey responds to the kind of stimulus the predator has just created. The eagle that repositions itself ahead of a flushing flock is not responding to what the flock is doing at the moment of repositioning. It is responding to what the flock is going to do based on what the eagle has already done to it. The hunting sequence is not reactive, it is prospective, and the prospective component is the part that prior descriptions of bald eagle hunting behavior had not formally documented. The team spent 2 years accumulating data before publishing. What they found across the full dataset was not a rare individual behavior exhibited by a single unusually clever eagle. It was a strategy practiced across the study population with a frequency and consistency that placed it firmly in the category of a behavioral pattern rather than an individual anomaly. Different eagles executed the strategy with different levels of sophistication. Older individuals appeared to be more precise in their repositioning behavior, arriving at the intercept point with timing that reduced the flock's response options more effectively than younger birds achieved. Young eagles in the population, birds in their first and second years of life, were observed following older eagles through the flushing sequence at distances that placed them within the predatory scenario the older bird had created without being the architect of it. The pattern of young birds benefiting from the hunting behavior of older, more experienced individuals without replicating the full strategy themselves was consistent enough in the data to raise questions about the learning pathway through which the behavior was transmitted. Questions the paper raised explicitly in its discussion section and that subsequent researchers have taken up. The question of whether this is instinct or learned behavior, or some combination of the two that does not resolve cleanly into either category, is the question that sits at the center of the behavioral ecology interest this discovery has generated. And it is worth working through carefully because the answer has implications that extend well beyond this particular hunting strategy in this particular species. The binary distinction between instinct and learned behavior has been losing its analytical precision in behavioral ecology for several decades. It was always a simplification of a more complex developmental picture in which genetic predispositions constrain and shape the behavioral repertoire available to an individual animal, while experience and learning determine which elements of that repertoire are expressed, refined, and maintained in a given environment. What this means in practice is that the same behavior can be simultaneously heritable, in the sense that animals with certain genetic makeups are more likely to develop it, and learned, in the sense that exposure to the right environmental conditions and, in social species, to the right conspecifics is necessary for the behavior to reach its full expression. Disentangling these contributions in a wild animal requires controlled experiments that are often impossible to conduct ethically or logistically in species of interest, and the bald eagle is no exception. What the observational data in the 2021 study can establish is a behavioral profile that looks more like learning than like a fixed action pattern. Fixed action patterns, the stereotyped behavioral sequences that are triggered by specific stimuli and run to completion regardless of context, have a characteristic appearance in behavioral data. They are uniform across individuals. They do not improve with age. They do not appear to be transmitted through observation of conspecifics. The flushing strategy, documented by the UC Santa Cruz team, shows the opposite of this profile. It varies between individuals. It improves with experience. And the pattern of younger birds following older birds through the sequence in a way that might represent observational learning is a direct challenge to a fixed action pattern interpretation. The behavior looks more like what behavioral ecologists call a socially facilitated skill, something that requires a genetic substrate of neural architecture capable of executing the component behaviors, but that requires social exposure and individual practice to assemble those components into the full coordinated sequence. The comparison that comes up most naturally in discussions of this discovery is with chimpanzee tool use. Chimpanzees in different populations across Africa use tools in different ways to solve similar problems. West African chimpanzee populations crack nuts with stone anvils and hammers. East African populations do not. The difference is not genetic. It is cultural, in the biological anthropologist's sense of a behavior that is transmitted between individuals through social learning, and that varies between populations in ways that reflect the transmission history of the behavior, rather than the genetic makeup of the individuals. The bald eagle flushing strategy shows a surface-level resemblance to this pattern. It appears to vary between populations. The UC Santa Cruz study documented it in coastal California. Subsequent observations have identified what appear to be similar strategies in eagle populations wintering on the Chesapeake Bay and in the Gulf Coast estuaries of Louisiana. But the behavior does not appear to be universal across bald eagle populations. Eagles in interior riverine habitats, where prey assemblages are dominated by fish rather than by flocking shorebirds and waterfowl, do not appear to use the strategy, because the structural conditions that make it productive, a large, coordinated, predictably responsive prey, flock moving in an open aerial environment, do not exist in those habitats. This geographic variation is consistent with either a culturally transmitted behavior or with a behavior that is latent in the species' behavioral repertoire but only expressed when the environmental conditions make it productive. The data does not yet cleanly distinguish between these interpretations. What the data does establish, and what makes it worth sitting with carefully, is that there exists in at least one bald eagle population a hunting strategy that requires the eagle executing it to do something that most prior accounts of raptor cognition did not include in their models of what raptors were capable of doing. It requires anticipating the future position of prey based on the prey's response to a stimulus that the eagle itself created. It requires distinguishing between the flush, which is a means to an end rather than the end itself, and the intercept, which is where the actual predatory capture attempt is positioned. It requires suppressing the immediate pursuit response, the neurological impulse to chase the fleeing prey directly, which is one of the most powerfully conserved behavioral tendencies in predators, in favor of a repositioning maneuver whose payoff is deferred by several seconds, and whose geometry requires a model of how the flock is going to move. These are not trivial cognitive demands. They are the kinds of behavioral requirements that, when we encounter them in mammals, we tend to describe using words like planning and strategy without much hesitation. The encounter with similar requirements in a bird species, historically characterized primarily as an opportunistic scavenger, requires some adjustment in the framing. The adjustment is not unprecedented. It is part of a broader shift in how behavioral ecologists have been forced to think about bird cognition over the past 2 decades. A shift driven by an accumulating body of experimental and observational evidence that has repeatedly demonstrated behavioral capabilities in birds that prior theoretical frameworks had predicted only mammals should possess. The New Caledonian crow uses tools that it manufactures from raw materials, according to a design it appears to hold in memory before manufacturing begins. The Clark's nutcracker stores tens of thousands of pine seeds in spatial caches, distributed across hundreds of square kilometers of terrain, and recovers them months later using spatial memory of a precision that exceeds what most mammals demonstrate in controlled laboratory tests. The Eurasian jay suppresses its preference for a currently desired food item when it has evidence that a conspecific will steal food of that type, demonstrating a behavioral flexibility in response to social competitive context that looks functionally similar to what developmental psychologists call theory of mind. The bald eagle flushing strategy fits within this pattern of discoveries without being reducible to it. It is not the same cognitive operation as Clark's nutcracker cache retrieval or jay theory of mind. It is a different kind of behavioral complexity expressed in a different domain. But it belongs to the same intellectual conversation about the degree to which bird brains, structured very differently from mammalian brains at the anatomical level, but now understood to be functionally more similar than their structural differences suggested, are capable of behavioral operations that prior frameworks classified as exclusive to mammals or to particularly unusual species at the cognitive extreme of the bird world. The anatomical context matters here, and is worth explaining because it is the part of this story that most general accounts skip over, and skipping it leaves the discovery floating without the theoretical anchor that gives it its full significance. For most of the 20th century, the dominant interpretation of bird brain anatomy held that birds lacked the neocortex, the layered outer structure of the mammalian brain that is associated with complex cognitive functions, including planning, working memory, and flexible behavior. Birds have a brain structure called the dorsal ventricular ridge that occupies roughly the position in the avian brain that the neocortex occupies in the mammalian brain, but its structure is different. It does not have the laminar, layered organization of the neocortex. For decades, this structural difference was interpreted as a functional difference, specifically as evidence that birds lacked the neural substrate for neocortex-dependent cognitive functions. The behavioral expectations that flowed from this interpretation were correspondingly limited. Birds were expected to be capable of sophisticated instinctual behavior, which was well documented, and operant conditioning, which was equally well documented, but not of the flexible, context-sensitive, prospective behaviors that neocortex-dependent cognition was thought to enable. The reinterpretation of this anatomical picture began in earnest in the 1990s and crystallized in a landmark 2005 paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, in which a group of neurobiologists proposed a fundamental revision to the nomenclature and conceptual framework used to describe bird brain anatomy. The revision reflected the accumulating evidence from neuroanatomical tracing studies that the dorsal ventricular ridge of birds, despite its structural difference from the mammalian neocortex, was homologous to the neocortex at the level of developmental origin and circuit organization. The neurons that make up the dorsal ventricular ridge of a crow or an eagle are, in terms of their developmental lineage and their connectivity patterns, doing essentially the same jobs as the neurons in the mammalian neocortex. They are organized differently, in a way that reflects the separate evolutionary pathway of the avian brain lineage, but they are not doing less. The structural difference, which prior interpretations had read as a functional limitation, turned out to be an alternative architectural solution to the same computational problem. Not a simpler solution, but a different one that produces comparable functional outputs through different means. The behavioral evidence that accumulated alongside this neuroanatomical revision demanded a revised cognitive framework for birds, and the framework that emerged from that revision created the theoretical space in which discoveries like the bald eagle flushing strategy could be properly interpreted. If bird brains are functionally capable of the kinds of prospective, flexible, context-sensitive computation that mammalian neocortices support, then finding birds doing things that require those computations is expected rather than astonishing. The astonishment belongs to the prior framework, which was wrong. The new framework predicts that systematic investigation of bird hunting strategies, particularly in species that face complex hunting challenges in variable environments, should reveal behavioral sophistication that the old framework had no reason to look for and would have had no way to properly interpret if it had found it. The bald eagle is an interesting species to have produced this particular discovery because it sits in an unusual position in the American cultural and scientific imagination. As the national symbol, it is simultaneously the most watched and the most mythologized bird in North America. The image of the eagle as a powerful, solitary, independently capable predator, the bird that hunts alone and needs no strategy beyond the brute superiority of its physical equipment, is deeply embedded in the iconographic tradition that grew up around the species. The discovery that at least some eagles, in at least some populations, are hunting socially in the sense that their hunting sequences depend on the spatial behavior of other birds and that younger birds appear to learn the strategy by following experienced individuals, complicates that image in ways that the iconographic tradition is not well positioned to absorb. The complication is not a diminishment. An animal that uses a sophisticated behavioral strategy is not less impressive than one that relies purely on physical capability. It is differently impressive, and the different impressiveness is more interesting, not less. But there is a way in which the discovery sits awkwardly against the cultural expectation of the bald eagle as a lone apex predator in the simple, direct, unmediated sense, and that awkwardness has probably contributed to the discovery's relatively quiet reception outside specialist circles. A finding that confirmed what people already believed about bald eagles, that they are powerful, independent, physically supreme hunters, would have been easier to absorb than one that requires revising the picture in a direction that, superficially at least, seems to make the eagle seem less like the symbol it has been carrying and more like the clever, socially embedded, behaviorally flexible opportunist that Benjamin Franklin was describing in 1784, which is what it actually... Let us work through the mechanics of what the flushing strategy looks like in practice, at the level of the individual hunting sequence, because the abstract description of a prospective positioning strategy is considerably less vivid than the actual behavioral sequence is when you follow it step by step through the data. The eagle is perched. This is the standard starting condition. Bald eagles spend a very high proportion of their active time perched, and the perception that this indicates laziness or passivity is a misread of a highly active information-gathering behavior. A perched eagle, at an elevation with sight lines across a bay, estuary, or coastal wetland, is conducting visual surveillance of a large area with an acuity that humans cannot match. Bald eagle visual acuity is approximately 4 to 5 times greater than human 20/20 vision, and their binocular field, while narrower than the human binocular field, is supplemented by a monocular field that covers almost the entire visual hemisphere. The eagle perched on a dead snag at the edge of a coastal marsh is not resting from hunting. It is watching the entire visual field available to it and processing information about prey location, prey behavior, weather conditions, wind direction, the behavior of other eagles, and the positions of alternative predators that might compete for or be exploited by a hunting attempt. The prey flock that the eagle is watching, a concentration of dunlins, or western sandpipers, or surf scoters, or bufflehead ducks, is not static. It is moving. Its position within the bay or estuary changes as individual birds feed, rest, and respond to tidal conditions. The eagle's watch is not a simple wait for prey to get close enough. It is a dynamic assessment of where the flock is, where it is going, what the wind and geography of the area will do to its movement options if it is flushed, and what position in that geography would allow an eagle to intercept a flock moving along its most likely escape route. The approach begins. The eagle leaves the perch and moves toward the prey concentration, but not directly. The GPS data shows trajectories during the approach phase that use terrain features, ridgelines, vegetation, and in coastal environments, the wave interface zone where visual contrast is lowest, to reduce the eagle's visual signature to the prey birds for as long as possible. This is not novel to the 2021 study. Approach concealment has been documented in raptors across many species. What was novel was the precision with which the subsequent movements were tracked, and the way that precision revealed the transition from concealment approach to deliberate flush to prospective repositioning as a structured three-phase sequence rather than a simple attack run. The flush. The eagle breaks cover in the sense of becoming visible to the flock at a specific distance, not the maximum distance at which the flock might detect and react to it, which would give the birds the most time and space to escape. Not at point-blank range, which would scatter the flock in all directions and reduce the predictability of its escape trajectory. At an intermediate distance that causes the flock to flush in a coordinated way, with the whole group moving together in the same broad direction, rather than fragmenting into individual escape flights. The calibration of this flush distance is where the strategy requires something that looks like knowledge of prey behavior. An eagle that consistently flushes a flock from the right distance is an eagle that has a working model of how close it can get before the flock loses its coordinated structure. That model, whether it is encoded in the bird's nervous system through instinct or built up through experience, watching flocks respond to its own approaches and other predators' approaches, is a representation of prey behavior that goes beyond simple stimulus response. The reposition. This is the phase that the accelerometer data made visible in a way that direct observation alone would have missed. After the flush, when the flock is airborne and moving, the eagle does not immediately pursue. There is a behavioral pause, or rather, a redirection, visible in the acceleration data as a shift in flight mode from the approach mode to a lateral or climbing trajectory that places the eagle in a new position relative to the flock's direction of travel. The duration of this repositioning varies between individuals and between hunting events. In the most precisely executed examples in the dataset, it is brief, 4 to 8 seconds of lateral or ascending flight. In younger birds or less precisely executed sequences, the repositioning phase is longer and less accurate, with the eagle arriving at an intercept point that the flock has already passed or that requires a longer pursuit phase to close than the more precisely timed sequences of experienced individuals. The intercept. The flock, moving along its predicted escape route, encounters the repositioned eagle at or near the intercept point the eagle has taken up. The flock contracts again, its edges folding inward as the new threat location disrupts its escape trajectory. In the most successful sequences in the dataset, the flock's response to the repositioned eagle produces a confusion of crossing flight paths at the densest part of the contracted flock, a temporary increase in within-flock collision risk that momentarily interrupts the coordination of individual escape decisions. It is in this window, the window of flock confusion at the intercept point, that the successful capture attempts in the dataset are concentrated. The eagle is not catching prey despite the flock's evasive coordination. It is catching prey by using the flock's evasive coordination against it, exploiting the temporary breakdown in that coordination that occurs when the flock encounters a second threat from a direction its initial escape trajectory was not designed to avoid. The elegance of this sequence, once you see it laid out, is the kind of thing that makes behavioral ecologists use words they usually try to avoid in formal publications. The 2021 paper is appropriately careful in its language. It does not use the word intelligence. It does not claim that eagles consciously plan their hunts. What it does say, in the measured language of peer-reviewed science, is that the behavioral sequence it describes requires prospective adjustment of flight trajectory in response to predicted rather than observed prey movement, and that this prospective adjustment is significantly more precise in experienced individuals than in naive ones, suggesting that the efficiency of the strategy improves with practice in a way consistent with individual learning. Those sentences, in the context of what was previously known about raptor cognition, are doing a great deal of work. The subsequent response from the behavioral ecology community has been measured but consequential. Several research groups have announced follow-on work aimed at determining the geographic extent of the behavior, whether it appears in other eagle populations, whether similar strategies have been overlooked in other raptor species, because the observational and technological tools to detect them were not previously available, and what the neurobiological substrate of the prospective positioning behavior looks like at the level of individual eagle brain activity. The last of these questions is the hardest to answer in a wild bird and will probably remain the most technically inaccessible for years. The first two are generating data at a rate that makes it likely the picture will look considerably more complete within the next research cycle. What has already emerged from the follow-on work deserves attention because it extends the 2021 finding in directions that raise the stakes of the original discovery beyond what the paper's relatively cautious framing suggested. A research group working in the Chesapeake Bay region published a preliminary dataset in 2023 describing what appeared to be a variant of the flushing strategy in eagles wintering on the Maryland eastern shore. The variant differed from the California version in an important detail. In the Chesapeake data, the flush that initiated the sequence was not always executed by the eagle that positioned for the intercept. In a subset of the documented sequences, the flush was performed by a second eagle, while the eagle that positioned for the intercept was already in the intercept position before the flush occurred. This is a different cognitive demand from what the 2021 paper described. The California version requires one eagle to suppress pursuit, reposition, and wait for the prey to arrive. The Chesapeake variant, if it is confirmed with additional data, requires one eagle to execute a flush and a second eagle to be in position for an intercept before the flush occurs, which means the second eagle anticipated not only where the flock was going to go, but when the flush was going to happen. That second eagle is anticipating the behavior of another eagle, as well as the behavior of the prey flock. That is a qualitatively more complex behavioral operation. The preliminary nature of the Chesapeake dataset is important to emphasize. The research team presenting it was explicit that their sample size was insufficient to distinguish between deliberate coordination and incidental co-occurrence of separately motivated hunting behaviors in the same location at the same time. Eagles in winter concentration areas are common enough that two eagles executing independent hunting approaches on the same prey flock at nearly the same time is not inherently improbable. The data pattern that would confirm genuine coordination, specifically temporal and spatial correlations between the two birds' movements that are tighter than chance co-occurrence would predict, requires a larger data set and more precise temporal resolution than the 2023 preliminary report contained. The research group has continued collecting data. The results of that continued data collection are expected in the literature in the next 2 years, and they will either confirm or refute a finding that, if confirmed, would substantially escalate what we think bald eagles are doing when they hunt together. The 2021 paper noted in its discussion section that the flushing strategy it described had likely been observed in fragmentary form by waterfowl hunters, birders, and wildlife managers working in coastal wetland habitats for years without being recognized as what it was. The observation is almost certainly correct, and it points to something important about the relationship between observation and understanding in wildlife biology that deserves a moment. Human observers watching eagles hunt in coastal wetlands have been seeing eagles flush flocks and then move laterally before pursuing prey for as long as humans have been watching eagles hunt in coastal wetlands. The movement was there to be seen. What was not there, before the tracking technology provided the resolution and the theoretical framework provided the interpretive vocabulary, was the ability to determine whether the lateral movement was a purposive repositioning aimed at a predicted intercept point, or simply a course correction made in response to the flock's movement after the flush. From a visual observation distance, these look the same. An eagle that flushes a flock and then moves laterally could be deliberately positioning for an intercept, or could be simply following the nearest available bird in a direct pursuit that happens to take it laterally. The difference between these two possibilities is invisible to an observer watching from a distance without precise timing data on the eagle's position relative to the flock's trajectory. This is the kind of distinction that technology changes. The GPS and accelerometer data allowed the UC Santa Cruz team to compare the eagle's position at the end of the repositioning phase with the flock's subsequent position, and to determine that the eagle was, in cases where the repositioning was executed by experienced individuals, arriving at a point that the flock reached after the eagle, rather than at a point the eagle reached after the flock. That is the signature of anticipation rather than pursuit, and it is only visible in the data because the data has the temporal and spatial resolution to distinguish between them. The behavior was happening before the technology. The technology revealed what the behavior was. This has direct implications for how we should think about what else might be happening in eagle hunting behavior, and in raptor hunting behavior more broadly, that is going on in plain sight without being recognized because the observational tools available have not had the resolution to distinguish between simple and complex versions of what looks like the same behavior at first glance. There are several candidate behaviors in the existing observational literature on bald eagles and golden eagles that researchers in the field have noted as worthy of closer examination in light of the 2021 finding. Cooperative hunting sequences between paired eagles have been described anecdotally in the literature for decades, typically in the context of territorial pairs hunting ungulate prey together. The accounts describe one eagle drawing the prey's attention, while a second attacks from an angle outside the prey's field of view, a two-agent version of the flush and intercept logic that is even harder to explain without reference to coordination. The anecdotal accounts are numerous enough and geographically distributed enough to suggest a real phenomenon rather than the projection of cooperative intent onto independently motivated individuals. They have not been subjected to the kind of accelerometer-based behavioral analysis that the 2021 paper applied to the shorebird flushing strategy. They are on the list of behaviors that the bald eagle research community has identified as priorities for that kind of analysis. Golden eagles, which are ecologically distinct from bald eagles but share their basic neural architecture and their position as apex aerial predators, have been observed in what appear to be relay pursuit strategies for hunting jackrabbits in the open country of the American West and the steppes of Central Asia. Relay pursuit, in which multiple predators pursue a single prey item in sequence rather than simultaneously, allowing each individual to maintain its maximum pursuit speed while the prey exhausts itself against a series of fresh pursuers, is a strategy that has been formally documented in several mammalian predators, including African wild dogs and gray wolves. If it occurs in golden eagles, it represents exactly the kind of prospective, multi-agent behavioral coordination that the 2021 Bald Eagle paper opened the door to reconsidering. The observations are fragmentary, and the interpretive alternative, that multiple eagles are simply attracted to the same pursuit independently rather than coordinating, has not been ruled out by the available data. It is the kind of question that is now being asked in a way it was not being asked before 2021. What the 2021 finding did to the research community studying raptor behavior was less a discovery of a specific fact and more a permission structure for taking a certain kind of question seriously that prior theoretical frameworks had made it difficult to take seriously. The question of whether raptors engage in prospective planning, in multi-agent coordination, in strategy rather than simple technique, was a question that the prior cognitive framework for birds tended to answer before it was asked. The answer built into the framework was no, at least not in any sophisticated sense, because the neural substrate was thought to be insufficient. The revision of that neural framework, combined with the hard observational evidence of the 2021 paper, replaced the built-in no with an empirical question that requires data to answer. That replacement is what matters most for the long-term trajectory of the field. The implications for conservation are less direct but worth tracing, because they affect how wildlife managers and conservation biologists think about what is lost when a raptor population declines. The standard conservation accounting for a species like the bald eagle focuses on population size, range, reproductive success, genetic diversity, and the ecosystem function the species provides as an apex predator. These are the right metrics for assessing population viability and ecosystem integrity. What they do not capture is the behavioral repertoire of the population, specifically the culturally transmitted behaviors that require experienced individuals in sufficient density for the transmission pathway to function. A hunting strategy that is learned by young birds through exposure to experienced adults is only transmissible if experienced adults are present in the population at densities that give young birds regular exposure to the strategy. A population reduced below that density, through hunting pressure, habitat loss, or chemical contamination, does not lose only individuals. It potentially loses the behavioral knowledge that those individuals carry, and that the individuals replacing them would have acquired through social learning if the experienced carriers had been present. This is a conservation concern that has been discussed most extensively in the context of sperm whale populations and elephant populations, where there is strong evidence for culturally transmitted knowledge of feeding locations, migration routes, and social behaviors that is carried by older individuals and transmitted to younger ones. The bald eagle case is not as well documented as either of those, but it raises the same conceptual issue. If the flushing strategy is transmitted through observation of experienced hunters, and if the bald eagle population on the California coast had remained at the population levels documented during its DDT-driven low point in the 1970s, when the California breeding population reached single digits in some coastal counties. Would the strategy have survived in those populations? The question is unanswerable in retrospect, but it is answerable in prospect. If current populations decline, if the legal protections that enabled the bald eagle's remarkable recovery from near extinction in the contiguous United States are weakened in ways that reduce population density in key habitats, the behavioral portfolio of those populations goes with the individuals who carry it. The bald eagle population recovery since DDT was banned in 1972 is one of the most frequently cited success stories in American conservation history, and it is a genuinely remarkable achievement. A species that had been reduced to roughly 400 breeding pairs in the contiguous United States by the early 1970s now numbers somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 individuals, a recovery of multiple orders of magnitude over 5 decades. The recovery is the result of the intersection of chemical policy change, legal protection under the Endangered Species Act, and direct management intervention in the form of captive breeding and reintroduction programs at the population's low point. It represents the system working in the way that the system is supposed to work when the political will and the scientific capacity to deploy it exist together. What the recovery did not restore, or did not necessarily restore, is everything that existed in the population before the crash. The individuals that survived the crash carried the genetic basis of the population forward. They also carried whatever behavioral knowledge they had acquired before the population decline. The individuals born into the recovering population after the crash acquired their behavioral repertoire from the individuals present when they were young. If the flushing strategy was present in pre-crash California coastal eagle populations, it would have required a transmission chain from pre-crash experienced individuals through the crash survivors to the post-crash recovering population. Whether that chain held, whether the strategy was present in those post-crash populations in the same form and frequency it existed in historical populations, is a question nobody was asking before 2021. Because nobody knew the question needed to be asked. The behavioral record that would answer it does not exist.